me welcome Jeff Veen.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Hi, everybody. I was just standing backstage looking at Chartbeat. Is that not the coolest thing? I can't wait to go try my 30-day trial. That was really impressive, which is good. I want to talk about designing and the charts and the stuff that you've seen today. We have been talking about data here for the last couple of days, open data in government, data up in the cloud. Tim keeps saying that data is the Intel inside for the web operating system. If that's the case, I want to sort of pose a question to all of you, which is, what is the Macintosh human interface guidelines for this new web-based computer? I want to talk about that today by rewinding a little bit and talking about the most important year, I think, in the history of Web 2.0, and that is 1974. How many of you were actually not yet born in 1974? Oh, no. All right, we got a lot to cover here. 1974, so to me, I think 1974 is interesting because it's kind of conceptually the end of the 60s, right? It didn't really line up with the calendar that well, but a lot of the stuff that was happening in the counterculture of the 60s became mainstream in the 70s, kind of around 1974. And I'll give you a couple of examples, right? Environmental, sustainability, right? That was sort of a hippie thing in the 60s, but really became a mainstream thing in 74 when we had the big oil energy crisis, and gas prices, if you could see that on the slide, shot up to 81 cents a gallon. So it brought home to a lot of people that maybe we won't have this unlimited supply of energy, right? Another one was this sort of centralized authority and this trust in the institutions, right? That was sort of anti-establishment in the 60s, but 1974, Watergate hearings, the President of the United States, I think here with one of his trusted advisors, the President of the United States quit and stepped down, right? And really kind of rocked the faith in a lot of the institutions that we have. I think, entertainment was changing, right? You think 60s, you think Beatles and Bob Dylan. 70s, like 1974, Kiss came out with their first album. Any of you had this poster in your room when you were a kid? I certainly did. But in business as well, we see these same sort of emerging trends, right? AT&T was this sort of naturalized monopoly, centralized communication infrastructure in this country. This is when Congress, or actually the House of Representatives, started to try to see if they could break it apart, which 10 years later they did. And then I guess 20 years after that, we've kind of put it all back together. But it started, right, in 1974. The same year that Vint Cerf and Robert Kahn wrote their seminal article mentioning the internet for the first time, right? So something was happening in that year. I want to tell you just a very brief story about something that happened to me in that year. This is a picture of me and my brother in 1974 when I was 6 years old, making fun of his ridiculous red plaid pants. But when I was 6, I remember my mom one day taking us shopping to a department store where we went to have lunch in a cafeteria, which was thrilling for me at that time. Cafeteria was very, very busy, and there weren't any tables, but we saw one in the back, kind of a weird-looking table, and we sat down at it, and it had this glass tabletop, and inside the glass tabletop was a television, and on the screen of that television was this. And I had never seen a video game before. This is the first time I ever saw it, and I remember having this little epiphany as a 6-year-old, thinking, wow, I can control what's on the screen. And it wasn't very meaningful for me then, but it really sort of played out over the course of my life. This, in fact, is what the machine looked like. I found this on eBay. This is what we were sitting at. But this is just the first step in a series of increasingly powerful tools that I got to use as a kid for controlling what was on the screen or participating in sort of the stuff that was happening, the media that I was consuming. And that is why I think the sort of 1974, it was a big shift, right? A shift from all of us as being consumers and trusting authority and things like that, this shift into participation and not just consumption. The other thing that happened in 1974 was the first commercially successful hard drive was shipped by IBM, the Winchester hard drive here. If you were to sort of they leased it to companies, so you couldn't actually buy one. But if you sort of worked out the lease and the dollars and the inflation and stuff, it rounds out to about $100,000 per gigabyte per month is what this machine cost. And you can see it was really effective because look at how productive those people are being there with all their data and their charts. if we sort of now zoom forward to where we are now, the price has changed a bit, right? You can lease, and in fact, I think it's now like 3 cents a gigabyte a month for the next 3 months as Amazon celebrates a birthday of their online storage data in the cloud. It's remarkable, right? Well, if we put these two things together, we can see some trends happening, right? We have now the tools for participation and the scale of data, and these things are coming together and kind of changing how we make stuff on the web today. I want to talk about that, and I want to give you a very simple example of how we deal with this overwhelming amount of data that is in our lives every day. I'm a designer. I design things. That's generally my approach to when things become overwhelming. I see that as an opportunity to make them simpler. And so if we were to take some data like this and have a look at it, we might not really know what we're looking at, right? I could, as a designer, add a little metadata to it, right? I could put some labels, and now we can see that this is rainfall total for North American cities. That's good, but it doesn't make it very accessible. So I could use some techniques, like, for example, typography. I could highlight some things, pull some things back, use a friendlier font, make it a little more accessible, or I could take another step and actually make the data come alive a little bit, and maybe use the value of the colors of the table cells to represent the values of the data that's in them, right? Now, even if you're in the back of the room, you can get a sense of patterns that are emerging in this data. I could maybe take that one step farther and do this. Maybe. Now we're starting to talk about what is our audience really expecting, right? If you were a bunch of meteorologists, you would probably say, actually go back. The numbers were a lot better. But perhaps if we're just like trying to plan a trip and deciding whether we should go to San Francisco and Miami, we can see that maybe in the summertime it's a little drier in San Francisco. So maybe, but that's dangerous, right? We get into this situation where we might be just decorating the data, which, the USA Today has sort of made a career out of. I've looked at this chart for months now. I have no idea what they're talking about with their sprinkler going off. And in fact, The Onion picks up on this and does this kind of stuff all the time. Like, these numbers add up to 143%, and, they're like, and there's examples of this all over the web, right? This is one of my favorite charts, which is the percentage of the chart that looks like Pac-Man. So it's dangerous, right? Like, it's pretty easy to slip into just like, decorating stuff and not actually finding the meaning of the data and trying to make that accessible to people. And this has been a concern of ours in the design projects that we've done over the last few years. We worked on a redesign of Google Analytics that came out a couple years ago. Recently, we just launched this thing called WikiRank, which shows you usage patterns and trends and comparisons on Wikipedia popularity and things like that. Our concern was always that we would start to decorate, right? And that we wouldn't be making it accessible. So we did a little research. And let me now rewind all the way back to 1854 and the cholera outbreak in London's Soho neighborhood, when people were literally like getting cholera and dying on the streets. This was, from this came some of the best information design that the world had ever seen at the time. And that was done by a doctor named John Snow, who also had a sort of proclivity for statistical information. And he basically looked at what was happening and started to make a geo mashup, right? Taking the data he saw and applying it to a map to see what was going on. Now, this had been done before, but it was really, this is a chart or a map from about 50 years earlier, when they believed that that disease came through the air, and you can see it looks like a big black cloud swarming over London, when he, in fact, had a totally different theory, that it was waterborne and that perhaps it was coming from one source. And he used this map with this data overlaid on it to convince the city council that the pump at the corner of Broad Street was the thing that was killing people. And he used data rather than superstition or religion or classism or any of those other things. He used data and analysis to prove to them, to convince them to take the handle off the pump. And you can still see this pump today if you want to go on sort of a weird data visualization pilgrimage. The pump is still there in Soho. Yes, I've totally done this. And actually, a nice little connection with this, the pub that you see right behind that pump is called the John Snow, named after him for saving the neighborhood. So data can change things if the stories are told correctly. This is one of the most famous visualizations of all time, Charles Joseph Minard showing Napoleon's march to Russia during the winter. There are so many different data points happening all at once here. The size of the line shows the number of troops that he has, and you can see it dwindling as at the bottom there, the temperature is dropping, right? And soldiers are falling over dead. It's a really remarkable chart. If you drill in, you see stories throughout this chart. For example, when he forced his troops across the Berezina River, when it was about, 20 degrees below zero, you can see right there where the arrow is pointing, 12,000 men died. Right? And that's a story that is in this chart, right? If you imagine a giant spreadsheet of troop logistics, you're not going to find those kind of stories as easily as looking at things like that. There are other ways to tell a story like that, right? This is the same event happening, but you can see in the data, by doing a visualization, we can pull that story out. One final historical example is Harry Beck, who, as you can see, was the designer of the London Tube system map. And I love this picture because he's got his chart and he's like, I made this. I'm so happy about this thing. And he did a great job. Like, this is the chart he was dealing with, right? This is the map that they had. But he was an electrical engineer, and so he spent his time making circuit boards, right, back in the 30s, and said, wait a minute, why don't we just apply that to the system? The only thing people really care about are where the lines connect, not where they are in the city. So successful that it's still the chart that we use today, not just for London, but for almost every subway map. So a really impressive example. And if we draw some conclusions from this, right, we can see that it's important that we find a story in the data. It is important that we assign different visual cues to each dimension of that data, just like I did with color and rain, and right, really help people look and visually understand what the data is telling us. And then, just like each one of these designers did, remove everything that's not telling the story and boil the story down to just the story that you're interested in. And that works fine if your data never changes, if you know what the story is, if you have a message as a designer that you wish to communicate. But that doesn't kind of match up with what we were talking about with the web, kind of at all, right? And if we think back about 1974, the one thing that we were trying to get over then was control. Right? Like, we were rebelling against centralized authority, whether it was the government or our phone system or whatever. We were trying to get out from under this control. We wanted to be producers instead of consumers. We wanted to control for our own selves what was happening and not let somebody else do that. I found this in the design world when I worked at Wired back in the 90s, and it was incredibly difficult for us to make that transition from magazine to website, right? Because we had to give up so much control by moving to the web. We didn't have ink on paper. We didn't even know what the paper size was. We didn't have control of type. We didn't even know what browser capabilities people had. And as it turns out, like, most people want to control their own web experience and not let some designer do it. And in fact, most of the websites I read like this, because I have the choice to do that, and I can do that. Some people don't have a choice. They have to read your website using this, right? They put their hands on the Braille keyboard, and the page is sort of read through that and converted to Braille, and they feel it in their fingertips. That's a very different way, but they need to have that control. They need to have that choice. So if we were to apply that, right, to our design work that we're doing here, where we're moving and trying to tell this story, we realize that that I, as a designer, and you, as a designer, or developer, or marketer, or anything, have to step back, let go of the control you've normally had in telling those stories, and empower people to tell their own stories, or to find and discover their own stories. And perhaps the next step in my rain design here would be something like this, where instead of trying to design the story, I design an application that allows people to find their own story. And this is, of course, an example that I threw together in about 10 minutes, but you get the idea, right? So perhaps we should enable people to find their own stories, because people have their own data. Here's a visualization of somebody's social network on Facebook. Here's a visualization of the music that somebody was listening to. They scrobbled it off through iTunes to Last.fm, and it's produced in this really amazing sort of pattern of behavior that they've been experiencing over the last few months, right? And it gets even more personal. Here, we're looking at stuff that's happened at everyblock.com, stuff that's happened in their neighborhoods, right? Data that's being synthesized and displayed in standard normalized ways for their neighborhood, or even more personal, right? Here's what you've been working on. This is Rescue Time, that monitors what you've been doing while you're using your computer, and it gives you charts and graphs that measure your efficiency, which is a bit of a nightmare in my opinion. But I think a lot of people find a lot of kind of value in getting that real-time feedback. Or perhaps one of the most personal things I've ever seen is fertility, oh, I'm sorry, which the Nike site, which has a chip on your shoe that talks to your iPod that sends that off to the internet so you can compare your bio data, right? And even more personal than that is fertilityfriend.com, where women can track their menstrual cycles as they're trying to get pregnant and chart and graph. This is an amazing graph, right? Because when the two red lines cross, you get to have sex. I mean, that's pretty impressive. So finding their own story is very important for people. We as designers, developers, product managers, we need to create tools to help people manipulate their data, right? So that's where a lot of this interactivity is coming from. Here's an example of using the data as the navigation source, right? Trulia is showing houses for sale here in Boston, and I'm scrolling across how much the houses cost to show me, right, like what neighborhoods are popular. Using the data as the point of navigation. Here's something we did when I was at Google, where we worked with Google Readers, giving people reports on their consumption of feeds as an interface for filtering through and kind of refining their subscriptions. Again, using the data, using people's behavior as a navigation source. Doppler does this with their social network. This is a great interface for visualizing who you're connected with, who you're not connected with, and sort of, managing that delta. Likewise, here's a project that we worked on when we were doing sort of real-time data with blogs about 4 or 5 years ago, using with MeasureMap, the thing that we sold to Google, where we could use the data as the navigation source. And then finally, providing filters allow us to sort of enable clarity for people. So whereas sort of John Snow and those guys were like reducing down the visual clutter of their designs to promote their story, we can give those same tools to people to help them find stories. So this is another Google product that allows you to sort of look at tremendous amounts of data. And what we're looking at here in the vertical axis is life expectancy for countries around the world. And on the bottom is the income per person. Each dot is a different country. The color is the continent that country is in. And the size of the dot is the amount of population. And as you see, if we push play on this chart, we can scroll through about 40 or 50 years of data. There's a tremendous amount of data that we're looking at here. But we can find individual stories that happen in this data by filtering that down. So if I were to sort of drill in on Botswana, right, and replay the animation over time, we can follow what happened to just that country over the course of the years. And you can see things are going pretty well, but then when we get to 1990, things go horribly bad, right? And here we have allowed our users to sort of find a story in this data. In this case, the horrible AIDS epidemic in Africa and the effects that had on the population of countries like Botswana. I think the New York Times has been doing a particularly good job of showing visualizations over time. Here's I like this visualization. Here we're scrolling across casualties during the war in Iraq. The thing I like about this, not only is that it's a filter that helps you understand the story, but it's also a visualization that they created in 2004 and just left running, right? So the story continues to tell itself over time, something that, frankly, the designers of the past never had to concern themselves with. So, one last example, a bunch of different visualizations, a bunch of different filtering tools from Google Analytics, again, using the data as a way of navigating through and finding the story. So if we were to sort of sum all of this up, I would say we have taken this shift, right, from storytelling, which authors and artists and designers have always done, and kind of shifted that to put users more in control and give them tools for discovery. If we thought about the visual cues that designers used to use in visualizations, super important, right? But now we need to give those as tools through interactivity to our users so that they can have control of that. And editing, right? That sort of reducing down to the core of the message, sure, right? That's really important for communication to happen and for designers to do, but now we need to think about that as filtering in the tools that we give our users. So I think there is a lot of inspiration that we can pull from the past, right? Like these dead white guys did a pretty good job of laying a foundation for us so that we can sort of take that forward. But here in now, in the web, in the things that we're doing, right, we need to think about tools that empower our users rather than us trying to have control of our applications, our designs, our websites. It's really important because I think there's the potential for all of this data that floods us all of the time to really be pretty confusing and overwhelming. But I have a lot of confidence that we can get through this because things are a lot different now than they used to be. Because now we can control what's on the screen. So thank you very much, everybody.